Well, we got to keep our bodies moving this morning because it is freezing in this chapel. But once you've said hi to a few people, you can go ahead and sit down. So excited to have Dr. Ken Stoltzfus here to share a message with us. And before we dive into the message, we have a tradition in chapel. We've been asking speakers 3 questions as a way of leaning into our theme this year of Fully Alive. And so we're just going to get to know you a little bit and have you start. We're going to ask these 3 questions and then turn it over. Sound good?
Great. Yeah, sounds good.
All right. So Ken is the Vice President of Academic Affairs here. And our first question is, what right now is a practice or a habit, something that you're doing that is bringing you life, helping you live fully right now, Ken?
Yeah, so my family and I have been part of a church plant here in Wichita for the last 5 years, and we only have one real pastor, so we've got a couple of fake pastors, and I'm one of them. I get to help preach about every month, and I'll tell you, I have a new respect for pastors because it is so much work. It takes pretty much a whole Saturday, but it has been so good for me. It makes me read the Bible in a different way. It makes me really think about the passages and study and go find what other people have said about it. So as much work as it's been a really life-giving experience for me.
That's awesome. I don't know what a fake pastor is, but
I am
we'll
one.
talk about that more.
Yeah.
If you could go back to your college self and give college Ken, one piece of advice, what would it be?
Well, I've got to tell you, my wife still laughs at the fact that I was a college professor and work at a college because I was a slacker in college. And so I would probably give my younger self, my college self, the advice of actually opening the books that I bought in the bookstore every semester, because they were often returned for resale without the binding being creased, you know.
Great advice.
Yeah.
Great advice. None of these students can relate.
I'm sure.
But that is something to be to remember. And then, what is some good news that you have to share with us?
Yeah, and I've actually got a picture of this in a moment. But in January, my daughter, our oldest child, we have 2 kids, got married, and it was just a wonderful day. They did it on January 1st, which was a little different. It was a Monday. But I'll tell you, there's something about seeing someone love your child. And our daughter just met this wonderful guy who does little things like brings her ice cream. The first week they were dating, she had a hard day at work. She's a social worker. He shows up at her house with ice cream, and I thought, he knows the way to her heart. She loves her some ice cream. And that's just sort of been their experience, where he's just loved her and supported her. And that's, as a father, that's just a wonderful thing to see.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, let's welcome Ken as he shares his message.
Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks for being here this morning. This morning, I might have bitten off more than I can chew. I'm going to try to talk about or try to answer, or maybe I should say wrestle with a little bit, the question of what actually happened during that first Easter weekend 2,000 years ago, and just to think a little bit about what that means for us today. But as I mentioned a moment ago with Mike, before I talk about Easter, I thought maybe I'd just tell you a little bit about myself. So this is my family. This is from my daughter's wedding, which I mentioned happened a few months ago. On the left is my son, Dylan, sort of the hippie of the family, self-proclaimed hippie of the family. Then there's me, my wife, Amy, who some of you might know Amy. She's in financial aid. She's Associate Director of Financial Aid. And just by dumb luck, she's traveling this morning, but I just got a text. She's watching from the Denver airport during her travels. So my daughter, Katie, of course, the bride, and then her husband, Garrett. And we love Garrett even though he went to WSU. Katie came here, Garrett went to WSU, but we've still accepted him into the family. So, and then there's one other member of my family I need to introduce. This is Taz. And I hear the ahs. This is how Taz pulls you in. Taz looks cute, right? Taz is kind of an evil genius of a dog. Let me tell you a couple things about Taz. One day, a few years ago, I was getting ready for work, and I was getting my breakfast ready, and I'd gotten out an orange and a glass of water, and I went back into the kitchen, which is right next to where our table is. You know, I put those things on the table, went back into the kitchen, and I come back out, and the orange is not there. It's nowhere to be found. And, you know, I'm getting older, and I thought, okay, maybe my memory's going. Maybe I just thought I brought the orange out, and I'm looking around. And then it started to click. Taz was also nowhere to be found. And when there's food involved, he's usually kind of hovering around. So I go looking for Taz, and sure enough, I solved the case of the missing breakfast orange. Taz had run off with my orange. Unfortunately, I wish I could say Taz learned his lesson. This is the last time Taz did this. This is not the case. A couple years after this, my wife and I made steaks for dinner, and we each had a steak, And we had 2 steaks up on a counter, and Taz is not a big dog. 2 steaks on a plate on a counter. They were for our kids. They were both at work. They were going to have the steaks when they got home. So we sat down, we prayed before we ate, and when we started praying, there was 2 steaks on a counter on a plate. When we got done praying, there was 1 steak on a counter on a plate, and Taz was long gone. And when we finally caught up with Taz, he was totally unrepentant. He looked at us sort of like, best day ever, you know. Couple other Taz stories really quick. Earlier this academic year, my wife and I came home on a Friday, kind of ready to, get our weekend going, and we could not find Taz anywhere. And he's got a dog door so he can go outside into a fenced backyard. Looked inside and outside. I actually went over and talked to our neighbor and said, "Hey, Farley, have you seen Taz anywhere?" And he's like, "No, I haven't seen him." Finally, we found Taz. Taz had gone exploring and gotten stuck under our deck, and all we could see was his nose. So guess who got to dig Taz out from under the deck on a Friday night? That was me. One more little Taz story. Taz has developed an affinity for eating trash, digging trash out of the trash can. And we have tried everything to keep Taz from doing this, including we went to the source of all goodness, right, Amazon, and looked up dog-proof trash can. And this is what Amazon sold us, 3 of these, where you have to sort of push the top in and then it pops up. And for 2 days, I was kind of like, in your face, Taz, you can no longer get in the trash. And then Taz had the last laugh, because 2 days later, Taz has cracked the trash cans. At first, he sort of broke them just by, or got in them just by knocking them over. Now he can actually use his face and press the top in and pop it up. I caught him doing it yesterday. So, like I said, cute dog, but kind of evil, right? He does whatever he wants, whenever he wants, and he just sort of does what feels good to him in the moment. I'm going to move away from Taz for a moment, although I'm a little worried with my wife watching. I might be in trouble for showing like 5 pictures of the dog and just 1 picture of my family, but I'm going to defend that because I'm going to come back to Taz a few times in my talk, so he'll come up again. I wanted to just sort of start off by talking about Easter weekend, and when I say Easter weekend, I'm using that sort of as an abbreviation for Good Friday, the day Jesus died on the cross, and also Easter Sunday, the day Jesus rose from the dead and came back to life. So I'm just going to say Easter weekend to sort of cover both of those events. And before I go any further, I mentioned earlier I might have bitten off more than I can chew. One of the reasons I said that is if you've read about Easter at all, if you've experienced it, if you understand it, there's way more happening in Easter than I can cover in a few minutes in chapel here. And so I talked to Mike and Miranda, and I said, hey, I think I can get through all of Easter by like 3 or 4 o'clock. They told me that was a bad idea. So I'm going to just sort of focus on one lens or one way of looking at the Easter story. But just know there's a lot of different ways of understanding this, and I can't begin to do justice even to that one way, much less all the different ways theologians and scholars have talked about this. So I want to just share 2 biblical passages that I'm going to refer back to during this sermon. The first one is from Acts, and it's the story of Peter, one of Jesus' apostles and one of the main leaders of the early church. Peter was asked to speak to a group of people who were interested in knowing more about Jesus, and this is part of what he said. He said, "You know the message God sent to the people of Israel, announcing the good news of peace through Jesus Christ, who is Lord of all. God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power, and he went around doing good and healing all who were under the power of the devil, because God was with him. We are witnesses of everything he did in the country of the Jews and in Jerusalem. They killed him by hanging him on a cross, but God raised him from the dead on the 3rd day." So that's the first passage. The second one, this is St. Peter, or the Apostle Peter. Paul, St. Paul, or the Apostle Paul speaking. And he says this about Jesus' death and resurrection. He says, "When you were dead in your sins and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive with Christ. He forgave all our sins, having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness, which stood against us and condemned us. He's taken it away, nailing it to the cross. And having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross." So I'm going to ask you just to keep those verses in the back of your mind for a little bit. I'm going to come back to them, but first I wanted to share a story, and it's a story from earlier in my career. I was a social worker, and I worked in the field of addiction treatment. So I worked with people with drug and alcohol addiction. And I spent almost 4 years early in my career working at a program for delinquent boys. So this was a house with 34 boys in it, and these were boys who had been convicted by the court of breaking the law, doing some sort of crime, and they also had drug and alcohol problems. And so we were supposed to help them get over both those situations, both the criminal behavior and the drug and alcohol use. So the picture I want to show here, this is a newer picture. It's from years after I worked at this place, but I wanted you to just get a sense of this place because it's going to sort of be relevant to the story. So on the left side of that picture, the building that's just peeking out behind the trees, you can see sort of a rounded roof there, a rounded porch roof. That was the rehab where I worked. That's where the 34 boys were housed. Across the driveway from that building is the brick building on the right of the picture. And like I said, this building's been fixed up quite a bit since I worked there, when this picture was taken. But that building, at the time I worked there, was really run down, and there were 5 apartment units in that building. And on the second floor, there was an empty apartment that you could get into by going up a fire escape at the back of the building. And someone had broken into that empty apartment, and it had become a drug house, a place where people would go at night to use drugs, and they'd go there at night so no one could see them going in and out of the buildings. They didn't have any right to be there. And you can imagine, if you're running a drug rehab, having a drug house right across that driveway, what is that, 20, 30 feet? That was not a good idea, right? That's not the ideal setup. So my boss contacted the owner of that building and said, hey, you've got a drug problem in this building, and we need you to do something about it. It had gotten so bad that a few of our boys had found drugs that had gotten dropped in the driveway and had used them, and it just was not a good scene. And the owner admitted there was a problem, and he offered to sell us the building at a low price. He kind of said, I'm not sure what to do about it. Do you guys want the building? So the drug rehab I worked for became the proud owner of a drug house. If you ever have a chance to buy a drug house, I actually don't recommend it, but it made sense for us to do it. And so the day we took possession of the property, the day we got the keys, my boss came over and he called all the counselors together, and he said, I want to take you over and show you this apartment where the drug use was taking place. And this is the disgusting part of the story, and hopefully it's not too close to lunch for this. When we entered that apartment, we were overwhelmed by just the worst smell I've ever smelled. We looked in the bathroom, and we found a bathtub filled with human waste. The sink smelled like urine. Because no one was renting the apartment, the water was turned off. The electricity was turned off, so it was sort of dark. Even though it was daytime, there was a little bit of light coming in, but it was pretty dark. Throughout the rest of the apartment, we found cigarette butts, drug paraphernalia, rotten food, insects, vomit. We found used condoms. It's a really sad part of the story, but I know from working in this field, in many drug-using communities, subcultures, there's actually a rate of exchange for people will do a sex act for a certain amount of time in return for a certain amount of a drug. And it's almost like exchanging money when you go abroad. It's sort of accepted in that community. If you do this thing for this long, you get this amount of drug. And so there's evidence that kind of thing was going on in that apartment too. And I share all this with you not for shock value, not to be disgusting, but when I went into that house that day, and when I experienced what I just described to you, I understood on a deeper level than I'd ever understood in my life before that day what it means for human beings to be in bondage, to be enslaved, to be imprisoned. It just makes no sense for anyone who didn't have to be in that house to go there of their own free will and to spend any amount of time there. I mean, can you imagine walking into that place in the dark? You don't know what you're going to walk in or what you're going to sit down in or what you're going to lay down in. Why would anyone do that? I'm convinced the only reason someone would go into that place is if they're so enslaved by something, they've lost their reason. I would almost say that the people who went into that house are on the verge of losing their humanity. They're living in a way that really is not that far from what Taz would probably consider his best life, right? I mean, they're doing what they want, when they want, whenever they want it, no matter the consequences. What is it that would lead human beings to live pretty much like animals? I think the answer is what the church, going back nearly 2,000 years, has referred to as the 3 things that tempt and enslave human beings: the world, the flesh, and the devil. And I want to just explain that a little bit, but this is a phrase, I actually looked it up because our church uses that phrase. We use it in the baptismal vows, that people, by being baptized, they're renouncing, they're giving up, they're turning away from the world, the flesh, and the devil. And it's something that sort of captured my attention, but I wanted to know where it came from, and it actually goes back to the 300s at least. So this has been used for almost 2,000 years by the church. And I want to just talk about those things a little bit. So the first one, the world, when we're enslaved by the world, we believe all the things the world's telling us. The people who went into that house every night, they didn't start off in that house. Most of them ended up there because they believed the world when the world told them that drugs would be fun, drugs would make them feel better, drugs would help them deal with the difficult situations in their lives. So the world enslaves people, it holds people hostage by promising things it can't deliver. On top of that, the thing your parents probably told you about the world is really true. The world isn't fair. In my career as a counselor, I worked with many people who were in situations similar to the situations that those people going to that house were in. And most of the people I worked with hadn't been dealt a fair hand by the world. They came from families in which dad had taken off and left them, families in which mom was struggling with addiction herself, neighborhoods in which selling drugs was the best way to reach the American dream. At least it seemed that way, right? It was a way to make money, to buy the things you saw on TV, the things you wanted. Neighborhoods in which joining a gang at a young age was maybe seen as the best way to make sure you'd be safe walking home from school every day. And even though I didn't know the people who went into that house every night, I'd worked with so many people in similar situations, I'm willing to bet that the vast majority of the people who entered that house every night came from very similar situations. I'm convinced that they came from situations where the world hadn't given them a fair shot at life. I'm convinced that the world had lied to them about what would help their situation. It suggested things like drugs and sex and all those other things that could be found in that house were the things that would help them to get out of or make sense of or deal with a broken and helpless situation. So on top of being enslaved by the world, I think the people who went into that house every night had also been enslaved by their own flesh, their own selves. They'd come to believe that getting what they wanted, when they wanted it, whether it was drugs or sex or a party or easy money or any number of other things, they'd come to believe that that was the route to happiness. Over time, they came to the brink of what I just described earlier, of basically living like an animal. And as I mentioned earlier, this is how Taz lives. If Taz wants an orange, he takes it. Taz wants to eat what's inside a trash can, he eats it. He does what he wants when he wants, and he does what feels good to him at the moment with no regard to the consequences. And human beings can reach a point where they're almost living in that kind of animal state. And that's sort of what happens when we're enslaved by these forces that we're talking about this morning. So as I mentioned a moment ago, for almost 2,000 years, the church has said that the things that enslave and tempt people are the world, the flesh, and the devil. And I've talked about the world and the flesh already, but I want to talk a little bit about the devil, because I think the devil is what's lurking behind both those other things, the world and the flesh. And I've got to say, for a lot of people today, even people of faith, even in churches, sometimes we're uncomfortable talking about the devil, and I don't really understand that, because if you read the Bible, Jesus actually talks quite a bit about the devil, and his name comes up quite a bit in the Bible. The Bible makes it clear the devil uses the world and the flesh to try to enslave and destroy God's creatures. And he does that to all of God's creatures, including all of us. Because here's the thing, it's easy to sit here on this beautiful campus on a nice spring day and think, I'm not like those people who go into that house every night. I'm not addicted to drugs. I'm not sitting in filth. I'm not having sex with strangers every night. I'm not living that way. And let me say, I'm really glad that's the case. I hope that's true. I'm glad that's the case. I believe it is. But that doesn't mean that we're not enslaved or in danger of being enslaved by the world, the flesh, and the devil, just as much as the people in that drug house were. But for most of us, we're in danger of being enslaved in much more socially acceptable ways, right? Ways that don't stand out quite as much. So let me tell you about a period in my life when I was enslaved by something. This is a silly thing. You might almost laugh at it, but I was a college runner. I ran cross country and track, so three seasons a year, cross country, indoor track, outdoor track. And for a while, I was enslaved by running. I was a pretty good runner. I wasn't great, but at one point in my life, just after college, I ran a mile in 4 minutes and 25 seconds, which is good, but not amazingly good. And I came to define myself by running. When I ran well, I was an arrogant jerk. I thought I was better than everybody, including my teammates. I had big fights and arguments with teammates just because of how I acted. When I ran poorly, which was much more often, I was just horribly depressed. I was miserable to be around. I was obsessed with being successful as an athlete. And as silly as it seems for someone like me, I didn't have the talent to go to the Olympics. I wasn't going to be a professional. But running had become my God. It had become the thing I cared most about in the world. And when that happens, when something other than God becomes the most important thing in your life, your relationship with that thing becomes a kind of slavery. And maybe some of you have experienced something like that. It can be a sport, a bad relationship. There's many ways that this can happen. And it's interesting, some of the things that enslave us are just evil and bad. Things like the drugs I mentioned earlier. I can tell you there is nothing good about heroin or crack cocaine or the drugs that were being used in that house. But the confusing thing is that sometimes the things that enslave us can be very good things if they're kept in their proper place. Things like sports and love and sex and money and achievement and a career can all be very good things if they're kept in their proper place, if we use them as God intends them to be used. But if they become the center of our existence, even those good things can enslave us. So it's not just the people in that house and people like them who are enslaved. All of us are in danger of that apart from God. So I know I've taken a long way to get around to it, but this is where the Easter story comes in. Because here's what I believe happened on that first Easter weekend 2,000 years ago. And remember, there's many ways of telling the story, but here's what I think is part of what happened. When Jesus died on the cross, I believe he went into every place where human beings were enslaved. Places like that drug house, but also places like my house, where I struggle with being enslaved by materialism and achievement and all these other things that want to take over my life. When he died on the cross, Jesus went into all those places where the people he loves, the people he created, the people he came to earth to save, where all those people are being held hostage by the world, the flesh, and the devil. And he says to the enslavers, take me instead. Do your worst to me. Make me the focus of all your attacks, all your hatred, all your evil. Pour it out on me instead. Take me and let the people I love go free. And so that's at least in part what the cross was. The devil pours out all of his wrath, all of his fury, all of his evil on Jesus. And in turn, he gives up his rights to us. We've sort of sold himself over to him. We allowed ourselves to become enslaved. He takes Jesus, gives up his rights to us, and he no longer has any claim over us. Jesus has taken our place. In one of our scripture passages this morning, the one from the book of Acts, Peter, one of Jesus' followers, again, is telling people about Jesus. And I want to just go back to part of what he said. He explains Jesus' mission like this. He says, God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and power, and he went around doing good and healing all who were under the power of the devil, because God was with him. And it's interesting to me that Peter, one of the leaders of the church, summarizes Jesus' mission as healing people who are under the power of the devil. My story about the drug house gives an extreme example of people who are under the power of the devil. But if we're honest, as I mentioned a moment ago, that's all of our stories apart from God. Without God, we're all in danger of that sort of slavery. It's just that for a lot of us, we're in danger of being enslaved in less obvious, more socially acceptable ways. And I should point out that even when Jesus sets us free from enslavement to the world, the flesh, and the devil, that freedom doesn't usually come easily or immediately. Now, I will say there are some stories of people with extreme situations, extreme addictions, and other problems, and they go from being enslaved to following Jesus, and they are set free immediately. In fact, I've even had the honor of meeting a few of those people. Years ago, I lived in Russia for a little while, and there's a huge addiction problem in Russia. I was able to do research with some people who were being discipled by the church, and through that discipleship process, they left drugs and alcohol behind them without professional treatment, without withdrawal symptoms, without getting sick, and many things they go through. But that's extremely rare. Occasionally, God does a miracle, but for most people, that's going to be hard work. That learning to live in that freedom, that learning to accept that freedom. For the people I've mentioned, the people who were going to that drug house every night, that work would start with following Jesus, but it would include things like going to drug rehab, maybe Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, doing the other things necessary to learn to live a different way. For many of those people, that would be the work of the rest of their lives with God's help. It's not easy work, and it's not easy for the rest of us either. For people like me, people who are in danger of being enslaved in more socially acceptable ways, it's meant getting real with a few trusted people who'll tell me when I'm in danger of falling back into slavery. It's meant practicing the disciplines we teach in our spiritual formation classes here at Friends, things like prayer and worship and Bible reading and confession and fasting, things that get my focus off of me and onto God, practices that help me learn to control myself and that teach me that I can't always have what I want when I want it, things that help me not to live like Taz, not to try to go through life doing what I want when I want, no matter the cost. So one of the things that happens over that first Easter weekend is that Jesus takes our place, and in doing so, he frees us from slavery to the world, the flesh, and the devil. The Colossians passage picks up on this theme as well when it says, Jesus cancels our legal indebtedness, the debt we owe because we've given ourselves over to the cross, or over to the world, the flesh, and the devil. Jesus takes our place, pays and cancels our debt, and nails it to the cross. So this idea of Jesus taking our place and freeing us from slavery is really important. But there's a second thing that happens on that first Easter weekend, and sometimes I'm afraid we focus so much on the first part of the story, we might miss the second part of the story, which is this. When Jesus dies and rises again from the dead, he not only takes our place and pays our debt, which is really important, I'm not minimizing that, but he not only does that, he also proves himself to be the supreme power in the whole world, in all the universe. Both of our Bible passages this morning acknowledge that part of the story as well. In the Acts passage, Peter tells those who are listening to him about God's good news of peace, talk about God's good news of peace, that it's proclaimed through Jesus Christ, who's Lord of all. Now, a lot of us, especially if you've been around church, you've come to chapel, you've heard Jesus referred to as Lord. But a lot of times in the modern world, we don't think much about what that means. It's almost like it's Jesus' first name, Lord Jesus, right? We don't think a lot about what that means to be a Lord. But it's really important to think about that because in the time during and just after Jesus' life on earth, to be a Lord meant to have supreme power. And the Roman emperor, at the time, Jesus and the people that followed him, the people that were part of his group, the Jews, they lived under the power of the Roman Empire. They'd been taken over by the Roman emperor. The Roman Emperor Caesar proclaimed himself to be Lord of all, or you might say the supreme power in the whole world. And honestly, that wasn't a completely wrong statement on Caesar's part. In Jesus' time, the Roman Empire had conquered not just the Jews, it had taken over the whole known world. Now, there were parts of the world like North and South America that they didn't know about, but any place they could march an army to, the Romans had taken over. They were just these fighting machines. And so when Caesar said he was Lord of everything, he actually had, at least in an earthly sense, a way to back up that claim. He could show you the map and say, all this is mine. My armies have taken all this over. So when Peter gets up and publicly says that Jesus is Lord of all, Jesus is Lord of everything, he's actually saying Caesar isn't Lord of all. And he's really taking his life in his hands, right? Because if you crossed Caesar, you were a traitor and you could be executed. And they didn't execute you in a nice way. Usually you died a painful, long death, something like crucifixion. So Peter, when he declares Jesus to be Lord, this isn't a throwaway line for him. This is the real thing. This is something that could really have consequences. Going on, I want to just go back for a minute to the Colossians passage because it also tells us a little bit about Jesus' lordship. This passage makes it clear that when Jesus dies and then rises again from the dead, he defeats all the powers and authorities in the world. And if you look into the Greek words that are translated here as powers and authorities, you'll find that phrase actually means anything apart from God that claims power here on earth. Things like Caesar and things like spiritual powers like the devil himself. And honestly, this passage is the closest thing the Bible comes to trash talking, which is kind of a funny thing to say about the Bible. But if you understand what's being said at the end of this passage, it's really powerful. This passage says that Jesus disarmed the powers and authorities. Remember, Caesar, Satan, everything that claims power in the world. He made a public spectacle of them, and he triumphed over them by the cross. Here's a picture of the sort of thing this passage is talking about. If you were living in Jesus' day, if you're living when Paul wrote this is what you would picture. This is what's called a Roman triumph. Paul used that term triumphing over the powers. This is what a Roman triumph was like. When a Roman general went to one of these other countries and captured it, he'd do everything he could to take the country's king and the generals alive, to take them prisoner. He didn't want them to die in the battle, and here's why. He'd put them in chains, he'd haul them back to Rome, and then if the victory is big enough and important enough, the Roman government, the Senate, would give the general permission to have a triumph, which was sort of this big parade that you can see in the picture here. This isn't a very good picture, but it's the best one I could find. And when he held a triumph, that meant that the general was allowed to march with his army through the streets of Rome, and he was allowed to drag the captured leaders from the defeated country behind his chariot in chains through the streets of Rome before he publicly executed them. And so if you can see this picture, again, not a very good picture, but you can see the general with his arms up, you can see the soldiers, and behind him you can see some people walking, and they've got chains around their necks, and those chains are attached to the chariot. This is the image that Paul was trying to get us to think of, right? This is what Jesus has done to Satan and all the powers, right? And can you imagine how humiliating that was for these people in this picture? You went from being the most powerful person in your country to being dragged in chains through the streets behind the man who defeated you. And again, this is the image Colossians gives us when it says Jesus triumphed over the powers and authorities. It tells us that when Jesus rose from the dead, He defeated death, hell, Satan, and every power that tries to set itself up on earth as a God or a Lord. And he didn't just defeat those powers, he humiliated them. He dragged them to the streets and made them a joke for the whole world to laugh at. So I'm going to close in a moment, but I want to invite you to focus on the two aspects of the story I've shared this morning when you think about the importance of Easter. First of all, Jesus went into places where humanity is held captive, enslaved and imprisoned, and set us free. He took our place. He absorbed the debt we owed for giving ourselves over to the world, the flesh, and the devil. He said, "Take me instead." And that's great by itself. It sets us free. It gives us a new chance at life, even though it usually means we'll need to spend the rest of our lives learning to live into that freedom. But Jesus doesn't stop there. Instead, he goes on to defeat those things that are trying to enslave us. And by doing so, he declares himself to be the supreme power in the universe. So I'm going to invite the band back up. I'm going to close in a moment here. I just wanted to end by saying, as Christians, we talk a lot about the gospel, and that's a Greek word that means good news. And this is the good news I want to leave with you today. Whatever it is that's trying to sink its claws into you, whatever it is that's trying to imprison you and take you captive, Jesus has already set you free from that thing. And beyond that, Jesus has defeated that thing and all the other things that are trying to destroy us. So on that Easter weekend 2,000 years ago, Jesus saved us from the world, the flesh, and the devil. And then Jesus defeated the world, the flesh, and the devil for all time. Jesus accomplished all this through his death, but in keeping with our chapel theme this year, he didn't stay dead. He became fully alive. And because of his death and resurrection, we can also be fully alive, free at last from the powers that want to enslave and destroy us, free to live the life God's called us to live. Let's celebrate that good news as we move forward from Easter and move into the rest of the semester. Amen.